Elden Ring sold 12 million copies in just 17 days, making it one of the best-selling games of all time. It received a score of 96 on Metacritic, making it one of the best-reviewed games of all time, and while it may not have happened yet, it's hardly a bold prediction to say that Elden Ring will win the majority of Game of the Year awards for 2022, and maybe even more honours beyond that. This is a level of success that is undeniable. Elden Ring is easily one of the most successful new IPs in gaming history, and if you measure success by both critical and commercial metrics, you could argue it is the most successful. This game's legacy shall be writ in gold, and it will leave its mark on the industry for many years to come. And Elden Ring is a good game. From Software have established themselves as perhaps the best developer of the modern era, and they are on an incredible run of producing hit game after hit game in a time when so many other big names have become more notable for their failures than successes. And I love From Software, but I still found Elden Ring to be disappointing. That may not sound all that remarkable. After all, you can't sell millions of copies without making a few people disappointed. But it's not just that I didn't enjoy my time with this game quite as much as I was hoping, but instead that I think From Software have lost their way and forgotten what once made their games so special. In fact, I think the player base might have done the same, and strange as it might sound, I even think the player base might be partly to blame. This video has 3 main sections, focusing on the open world, the difficulty, and the story. And the name of both sections might give you an indication of what they'll be about. Still, I can't promise that every point raised within this video is completely unique. This game has been out for a while, and I'm sure a lot of people have said a lot of things. What I can say is that the main argument I'm making is not something I've heard anyone else voice, and yet to me, it feels like something that needs to be said. Now, you don't have to watch this video. I've been upfront about what it's about, and I think people should make up their own opinions on games, and that people should think for themselves. Although, I guess that's a little bit of a spoiler. Speaking of spoilers, there will be plenty for Elden Ring, as well as several for Dark Souls and some minor references to other From Software games. And with that out of the way, let's get into it. I don't want to give the impression that I hate this game, so before getting into my main criticisms, it seems only fair to acknowledge some of the ways Elden Ring is superior to other From Software titles. In many ways, Elden Ring is like Dark Souls, but rather than taking its familiar formula and trying to polish it to perfection, Elden Ring instead seems to be about exaggerating it to grandness. This game is huge. Previous titles weren't small, but Elden Ring still manages to dwarf them, while consistently impressing with its unrivaled sense of grandeur, which is supported by the game's art style, soundtrack, enemy design, map size, architecture, weapon variety, boss quantity, and more. And ultimately, this ends up being one of the main qualities that gives Elden Ring its own identity. Dark Souls and Demon Souls had much more grounded settings, and their specific flavour of fantasy was overwhelmingly dark. But Elden Ring is more high fantasy, and its use of rich, vibrant colours alongside diverse locations with an often imposing sense of scale is, at its best, absolutely jaw-dropping, and it is often at its best. Some might argue that other games are more graphically impressive on a technical level, but to me, overall graphical fidelity means little when compared to a game's art direction, and in this aspect, Elden Ring might be the most visually impressive game I have ever played. Exploring this world feels like stepping into a painting, but unlike a painting, it also offers the player freedom to go wherever you see. From Software have always excelled at creating impressive sights, but this is the first time players aren't artificially limited by the edges of the game's levels. You can go anywhere. Your journey is fully seamless, and when you do get to one of the game's denser, more traditionally structured locations, you always have a sense of how each one fits into the world, enhancing their contextual meaning. To go alongside this freedom to explore, Elden Ring also provides the player with more tools than ever before. The star of the show is the familiar stamina-based combat system, and this is still a very combat-focused game, but within this combat the player now has more options, and no playstyle seems to have been completely overlooked. Shield users get guard counters to provide a new offensive option, dual wielding returns with its own dedicated attack animations, jumping offers new offensive and potentially defensive combat actions, Spirit Ashes offer a strong enhancement for anyone who doesn't want to tackle all the game's challenges alone, a stealth system now exists and can sometimes be useful, enemies including some bosses can be stance broken, giving the player a chance to critically hit them and providing a reward for player aggression and using heavy attacks. Ashes of War give individual weapons greater flexibility and allow for more experimentation, while providing non-magic users some flashy magic-like abilities to spend FP on. Magic users themselves have more spells to play around with, and everyone has more weapons to choose from. There's also a horse. There are some balance problems, of course, but this is objectively the most complex and diverse the combat in this series has been, and as this is such a long game with so much combat in it, more options are always a positive. As for the horse, it provides a new way to approach combat encounters in the open world that is surprisingly successful. I say surprising because the track record for pre-existing series successfully adding mounted combat is quite frankly appalling, and I don't think many would have expected the Souls-like stamina-based combat to prove an exception to this, and yet From Software have pulled it off remarkably well. Torrent feels responsive, maneuvering in combat isn't overly restrictive, and overall this adds a new option for players that feels suitably balanced. Mounted combat can feel rather unpredictable, but in some ways I think this works in its favour. In effect, you trade defensive reliability for mobility, while still getting to keep your high damage. This means Torrent becomes a great option for fights where mobility is particularly important, like against dragons, or for fights where you just don't really respect the enemy's offensive capabilities. And if you do want to play it a little safer, or you're just up against more dangerous opponents, the player still has an incentive to dismount and tackle them on foot, where you have your full array of combat options. So, as a way to balance mounted combat, forcing the player to sacrifice defense seems the best option. If you instead had to sacrifice damage, it would just make mounted combat boring, and if there were no drawbacks, players would rely on mounted combat too much, to the point where gameplay would be less varied. The "Are you sure?" pop-up message that defaults to no for resummoning Torrent in combat was a strange choice, but in the grand scheme of things, mounted combat is a resounding success. And so, with more tools at your disposal and more content ahead of you than ever before, Elden Ring becomes this near never-ending adventure that takes you through countless stunning vistas that are always accompanied by the strong combat system. And I can respect that. This game didn't need to be this big, and that size does lead to some drawbacks, but it also makes Elden Ring stand out, and there is something special to a game that just keeps going, that whisks you away to this whole other world and gives you so much content that you're able to completely lose yourself in the experience. Unfortunately, as much as I wanted to enjoy that experience, that wasn't quite what happened. Going open world is nothing new. For big budget games, the 2010s may have been the decade of the open world, with many of the best-selling and most highly reviewed titles being as such, and with many of the biggest and most acclaimed franchises becoming open world. So at this point, going open world feels a bit like jumping on the bandwagon, and many people have come to be critical of this trend. And then, in comes Elden Ring, and now apparently open worlds are changed forever. Elden Ring has ruined, no, destroyed all other open worlds. Elden Ring has revolutionized the genre. Welcome, comrade, this is the revolution. Now grab your phone and smash that like button on Twitter, because that's how we do revolution in 2022. Take that, Ubisoft. Revolutionizing the open world genre. That would be pretty impressive, if it were true. Really though, Elden Ring's world is the same open world we've been seeing for years. It's designed in the same way, and it has many of the same flaws. Outside of the unique setting, there are only two things which set Elden Ring's world apart from those so many people criticize. The first is good combat, which is not revolutionary, but it is important. Most open world games, regardless of how large their land masses might be or how many side activities they try to cram into them, are still combat heavy games, and therefore the better the combat, the better the open world. Elden Ring has good combat. It's like Dark Souls 3, with some extra bits, and that's a hell of a lot more enjoyable than most games manage. But it's not revolutionary. The other thing that sets Elden Ring's world apart is the lack of map markers, pop-up notifications, quest logs, and checklists. Elden Ring's exploration is much more intrinsically driven than most others in the genre. You are still rewarded for exploring, much like in other From Software games with the usual equipment, consumables, and upgrade materials, and as the game is challenging, it means upgrades feel useful. But in most ways, the reason you head out into the world and explore is because it's fun. You aren't doing things because a map marker or side quest is telling you to, you're doing it because you want to. You want to see what's over the horizon, what enemy awaits you round the next corner, and where the next stage of your journey will take you. This is more immersive, as there are less video gamey elements getting in your way, and it's more freeing as you're making decisions for yourself without the developer's hand constantly guiding you. Basically, Elden Ring has faith in the player that you'll be able to find things on your own, and it has faith in itself that the experience of playing the game is enough of a reward without adding additional extrinsic metrics on top to try to heighten your sense of accomplishment. And this is an improvement. It is insane how many open world games are so extrinsically driven and try so hard to signpost all of their content. There is clearly a problem with this genre. It is a disease, these games are sick, they have lost their mind, these elements aren't needed, they never have been, and hopefully this will actually improve now that Elden Ring has so clearly shown that if your game is actually fun, then all these constant markers and notifications do is get in the way of that. And if you think that is revolutionary, then fine, you are no comrade of mine, but I will begrudgingly respect your different opinion. But this isn't anything new, because older open world games also lacked these elements, and so do certain modern open world games, and this is all just one step in the right direction. Because really, the only thing you'd need to do to turn Elden Ring's world into a Ubisoft one is to add in map markers for its repeated side activities, like the ruins, caves, mines, catacombs, everjails, churches, erdtrees and world bosses, that would then unlock when you pick up pieces of the map. And then add some way to track your progress that gives you bonus runes for completing things, and voila, you have Ubified Elden Ring. Because the world itself isn't designed differently, it just doesn't include the markers and checklists. This is still a big, pretty to look at world, full of open space and evenly placed side activities inserted to make the world feel full of content and give players lots to do. Elden Ring is just a bit better at disguising this same structure. So what's the problem, you might ask? I did just say better, after all, and in a comparison between Elden Ring and Assassin's Creed whatever, I'd happily be on Elden Ring's side. But that's not what I feel Elden Ring should be compared to, and compared to some of From Software's other games, Elden Ring's open world is lacking in certain ways. For example, you no longer have to learn your way around and mentally map out each location as you explore them, because you have an actual map with a marker that always shows your location. There's also no sense of real danger or tension anymore, because sites of grace are everywhere, and new respawn points called Stakes of Marika have been added, so you always respawn close to where you die, and your dropped runes now come with a map marker to help you find them, and you can ride a horse, making it easy to outrun any and all enemies to just whiz around the map, retrieving your dropped runes, picking up items, or just travelling to your next destination. If you do want to fight enemies, you can, but if enemies want to fight you, they better ask nicely and hope you take pity on them. So there's no longer a sense of real danger, nor do you need to worry about running out of healing, and nor is there any build-up of tension as you struggle to find the next bonfire or reclaim your runes. Because in this open world, you're always safe, and only endanger yourself when you opt into a combat encounter on your terms. There's also no consequences to where you go and what you do anymore, as you can't get lost or stuck, because as long as you're not inside a mini-dungeon, you can just fast travel whenever you feel like it. This difference is even more noticeable on subsequent playthroughs, as when you're familiar with the world's general structure, you can easily collect items like golden seeds, sacred tears, and smithing stones to greatly increase your power right out the gate without engaging a single enemy. The end result of all this is that the gameplay in the open world is less interesting than it is in a more traditional From Software level. It basically just comes down to riding around on torrent and enjoying how the world looks as you move between the more meaningful pieces of content, much like many other open world games. It doesn't help matters that much of the world is wide open space, meaning From Software are greatly limited in the ways they can use space to create combat variety. You see, usually it was the level design that From Software utilised to keep things fresh, by creating ambushes or limiting space so the player has to be careful with their weapon swings and dodges, or using verticality to create areas the player can fall off, or hiding enemies and traps around corners and out of sight, or adding in environmental hazards, and so on. Meanwhile, in a wide open space, you can't do any of this, so From Software instead resort to throwing mini-bosses or just very strong normal enemies at the player ad nauseum, as these become the only way they have left to actually create challenge. This comes at its own cost, however, as it leads to repetition and, quite likely, boss fight fatigue. Ask many From Software fans why they like these games, and the boss fights will be a common answer, but as with most things in life, they are still better in moderation. Elden Ring ignores this. There are 157 boss fights in this game, and 237 encounters with a boss or enemy that sometimes shows up as a boss. That is quite a lot. By comparison, Dark Souls only has 26 boss fights, and yet I never thought it was a game which needed more, because each one of these encounters feels like a memorable event. And this is even true for a boss that is incredibly easy, because this lack of difficulty still at least makes this fight feel distinctive within the context of the rest of the game. Yes, sleep easy, Pinwheel, no one is making fun of you today. For once. Of course, we do have to be critical of Dark Souls for its use of repetition, as the Asylum Demon actually shows up again not once, but twice, meaning really there are only 24 unique boss fights in Dark Souls. This is something many people have harshly criticised this game for over the years, as I guess everyone agrees that each boss fight should really be completely unique. Meanwhile, Elden Ring has 9 unique bosses. Renala, Radahn, Rykard, Malenia, Malekith, Radagon, Fire Giant, Placidusax, and Sir Gideon Ofnir the All-Knowing. There are 157 bosses, and just 9 of them are unique. If you're curious, the average reuse rate of boss-type entity is 3.89. That is how many times you fight each boss enemy on average, and that number is quite frankly far too high. Even if the average player won't encounter every boss on a normal playthrough, they will still encounter too many, and too much repetition. It is almost unavoidable when there is this much of it. Now, to be fair, Elden Ring has many fantastic boss fights, and when considered in their totality, the number and quality of this game's bosses is incredibly impressive, but that doesn't change the fact that the game's structure, with its high frequency and repetition, acts to diminish these boss fights to the point where they quickly stop feeling special. This could be improved if there were simply less, and no other change would be needed. Just take an eraser and remove around 50 of these less impressive encounters, and then remove the boss health bar of a few more who don't deserve it, and then let the remaining 70 or so shine so much brighter as distinctive, unique, and memorable events, just like boss fights always were in the past. 70-something would still be a lot, and surely this would be enough. This problem isn't unique to the bosses, however, as the same criticism can be made about the side content, such as the caves, mines, catacombs, and everjails, which likewise include a staggering amount of repetition, from enemy types to boss rooms, layouts, and other commonly used assets, making them quickly feel repetitive and uninteresting. There is no reason an open world needs to be absolutely packed with things to do, and so many open world games do this to their detriment, even the better ones. Skyrim has far too many dungeons to the point where it undermines the believability of the world. Breath of the Wild has too many shrines, making them feel repetitive. The Witcher 3 has too many points of interest, making completionists go actually insane when they get to the waters of Skellige, and so on. This feels a bit stupid, as developers do more work to make their games worse, and Elden Ring is no different. Clearly, there must be reasons these games are designed this way, and I can only conclude that developers are so scared of their worlds being called empty, but they go too far in the other direction, even when it comes at the detriment to the overall experience. Either that, or these games are simply designed for the type of player that doesn't want to explore, so that even those who rush through the game and only engage with a small amount of optional content will still discover lots to do. This is particularly frustrating when it comes to Elden Ring, however, because if there is one developer you would expect to not care about making their worlds feel arbitrarily full, or trying to appeal to less engaged players, it would be From Software, who have a well-established history of allowing secrets to feel secretive and not caring about whether players find everything, as well as rewarding players who do take the time to thoroughly explore their worlds. In Elden Ring, however, it feels more like you're being punished for thoroughly exploring because of the quantity of repetition. Still, I'd be willing to overlook a lot of this repetition if not for another problem it creates. After all, From Software clearly wanted Elden Ring to be a huge game, and as I said earlier, that is something I can respect. Creating a game of this size means reusing certain assets is almost inevitable, and it's not like other open world games don't reuse their fair share of content either. But again, this isn't a question of other open world games, and one of the main things which has always made From Software's worlds stand out is how cohesive and realistic they seem. These are places where every single enemy and item seems like it exists for a specific reason, and where game design always seemed to be informed by the logic of the world. And then you have Elden Ring, which has 49 minor dungeons, where every single one of them has a boss in their final room guarding a single piece of treasure, and everything about this just screams, this is a video game. That these are pieces of content designed from top to bottom to specifically meet the needs of a game, and not as a reflection of what this world would actually be like. That is why they are evenly spread out across the world. That is why assets are repeated so much. That is why there is always one boss fight instead of 0 or 2. That is why the boss is always in the final room. That is why there is always one end piece of treasure. That is why there is always one site of grace at the start and one teleporter at the end. And that is why these places ultimately exist. And to me, this feels incredibly artificial. No boss that comes at the end of a cave or tomb will ever be impressive because they don't feel like an actual part of the game's world. And completing the same short cave that I've already completed 10 times before doesn't create any real build-up. And defeating them and continuing on my journey doesn't have any sense of genuine meaning. Also, I don't understand how some of these bosses even got here. The Magma Worm, or the Falling Star Beast, literally cannot fit through the earlier parts of their cave, and don't even get me started on Estelle number 2. And it's not just the minor dungeons where repetition harms realism. There are so many repeated bosses in this game that even entities as unique as the demigods aren't immune from it, as we see with Morgott, Mog, Godfrey, and Godric. I mean, what exactly is a Godfrey the Grafted? This feels like walking into a Lidl and seeing an off-brand copy of one of your favourite products. All I can say is thank God there's no Melanio Blade of Michaela skulking around in a cave somewhere. Not all repetition is unrealistic. I have no problem with there being multiple Night Cavalry or Erdtree avatars because these seem like beings where multiple versions of them might exist. But there is so little in this world that is allowed to be genuinely unique in a way that just screams classic open world developer desperate to squeeze out every last bit of value from any and all assets. The thing is, once the illusion of the world starts to crumble, it can be hard to keep giving it the benefit of the doubt instead of seeing more and more areas of artificiality. Maybe my standards are too high, but these are standards created by From Software's other games, and I didn't realise that going open world would mean they would have to be discarded. And that's what seems to have happened with Elden Ring. The fear of a franchise going open world is that it results in its core appeal being diluted to fit into a bigger area across a longer playtime, with the only real benefit being an increase in spectacle from travelling around the world and enjoying how it looks. And that describes Elden Ring perfectly. Luckily, however, Elden Ring is not just an open world, and the game's 6 designated legacy dungeons, as well as some of the denser underground and optional areas, still capture much of what the open world loses. All of these legacy dungeons are high quality, but Lindell in particular stands out as maybe the single greatest area From Software have ever created. It looks incredible, it communicates a strong sense of history and lore, it is deeply non-linear, and it is massive in size, particularly if you also include the sewers below. Here it feels like you're not just fighting strong enemies as you ride around, but are actually exploring an entire city bit by bit, where you have to be careful and methodical, and you feel fully immersed, and it is fantastic. Stormveil Castle wasn't far behind either, particularly as it was the first place I went to in-game, which led to it being the only time that I really felt the pressure of needing to preserve healing and care about taking damage. The other legacy dungeons all have many positive qualities too, although I did completely miss Volcano Manor on my first playthrough because I never found the entrance. In the end though, these legacy dungeons ended up saving Elden Ring for me, and without them, I cannot imagine how hollow the open world experience would feel on its own. And yet, at the same time, I can't help but wonder what this game would be like if it was all legacy dungeons. You know, if there was more of these areas and they were all interconnected seamlessly in a way that provides lots of non-linearity and loops back on itself as you progress through the game. You know, like Dark Souls 1, but bigger and with better graphics. Elden Ring benefits from having a larger budget and longer development than From Software's other titles, as well as from being able to iterate and learn from previous games, but the open world itself just doesn't seem to have added much to the experience, particularly when you get to repeat playthroughs. Maybe I would feel more charitable if it felt like the open world had taken more risks. For example, I have been waiting years for a developer to finally have the balls to not show a player marker on the map so that players must orient themselves through visuals alone. This would require the world to be designed in a way that provides helpful visual references for players to use to orient themselves, you know, something like having a great big tree in the middle that players can always see. But the benefit would be a more immersive experience where navigating the world involved genuine engagement from the player, just like it used to. In the end though, I don't think there are any real risks taken by Elden Ring in its world design, and instead, much of it is just copied from other games in the genre, including, unfortunately, some of the problems. You could say the open world was worth it because it looks good, but the legacy dungeons don't exactly look bad. And you could say the open world is worth it because it gives players more freedom, but I'm not actually sure if overall that's really such a good thing, because Elden Ring's freedom has some pretty severe consequences. Overall, I found Elden Ring to be too difficult. The first thing I did after the opening is head to Stormveil Castle, because that was the advice the game gave me, and in my time with From Software games, I have learned to never ignore some free advice, as you don't tend to get much. At Stormveil, I encountered Margit, who I found frustratingly challenging for the game's first boss. It took me a little over 1 hour to defeat him, during which I never once considered that this was the game's way of telling me to go somewhere else and come back later when stronger, because the game had explicitly told me to come here, both through NPC and the new Light of Grace system, and so instead I thought to myself, I must be a bit rusty at these games, because I'm sure the first boss isn't usually this hard. Afterwards, I proceeded through Stormveil and found it to be challenging, but not overly so. Godric was similarly no pushover, but considerably easier than Margit, probably because I had gained quite a few levels through exploring Stormveil. Before continuing further, I decided to explore Limgrave, which I found to be a bit too easy, almost as if this content was meant to be completed before Stormveil. Then I found Siofra River, which was a fantastic moment of discovery and was about the right difficulty, being challenging without seeming unfairly so, and then I proceeded to Liurnia, which again seemed well balanced. Then, after some thorough exploration, I moved on to Mount Gelmir, assuming that's where the game wanted me to head next. This seemed fine until I met the full-grown space ball, who destroyed me. The problem was that getting hit a single time would always dismount me, and after being dismounted, my damage seemed incredibly low, while the beast damage was very high, with some attacks killing me in one hit even from full health. After over an hour of attempts where I had barely managed to push the beast into its second phase, I decided this is not right, and that this is clearly an enemy put here to tell me I'm too low level to complete the rest of the area. This isn't actually true, as this is just an unusually high level enemy, and you can even just go around it to do the rest of the zone. But this is what I assumed, so off I went to the other area an NPC had told me to go, Caelid. On arrival, I found I was cutting through bosses rather easily, making me think, well, fuck, I've accidentally overleveled by coming here too late. But then, as I explored a little further, sticking to the north as that seemed like the best way to head first, I found the game suddenly became a lot harder. In fact, I found an exact replica of a boss I had just killed only a little earlier and a short distance away, and yet this time it was hitting like a truck and had 4 or 5 times as much health. This seemed very strange to me, as this was the same enemy in the same area, and then, eventually, just like with the Falling Star Beast, I got stuck on another boss, this time the Godskin Apostle. This was again frustrating because I didn't feel like I was playing that badly. I was dodging, punishing, improving, but it still wasn't enough. The numbers just seemed to be stacked against me, with the boss doing too much damage and having too much health. And so, after 1 hour of never coming close to a kill, I gave up. At this point, I couldn't understand why the bosses within a single area were so vastly different in difficulty, but I decided I didn't want to get stuck again just yet, so I went looking for somewhere new, which led me to the south of Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula. I figured as this was a completely separate area and no one had hinted that I should come here yet, it's probably going to be an overly difficult endgame zone, but then I found it was the complete opposite. Turns out you're meant to come here before Stormveil, meaning I was so overleveled that every enemy I encountered simply melted before me. Sometimes I did still press the dodge button, but it was only out of a sense of politeness to my foes because I certainly didn't need to use it. On this peninsula, I also found many healing flask upgrades, which was something I really could have benefited from gaining earlier. Still, with this major healing boost, I headed back to Caelid, killed Radahn, who I was able to DPS down so fast he couldn't enter his second phase, thanks maybe to a lucky stagger, and yet other minor mini-bosses in this area still destroyed me, which felt odd, as Radahn seemed like he should have been powerful, but was instead weaker than a lot of the other bosses here. Still, from here I proceeded to the Altus Plateau, and then Lindell, which both seemed too easy again. And then I went to the sewers, which were more challenging, and then the mountaintop of the giants, even more challenging, and then I took my new medallion to find the consecrated snowfields and the Halig tree, which were even more challenging, and then, finally, I reached the bottom of the Halig tree, where I stayed for many hours.
I am Melania, Blade of Mikola. And I have never known defeat.
Now, hopefully you're still watching the video and haven't been bored away with so much recounting, but I do have a reason for going into this much detail. You see, I played this game blind. I avoided every piece of information, every discussion, every review, every meme, all to try and have a better experience with the game. I did this for other From Software games too, although the one exception was actually Dark Souls, which was the first game I played and which I found so intimidating that I remember checking several things online about where to go and when, as well as how to upgrade weapons and things like that. That said, I didn't look up everything, not even close, and even then this was something I tried to avoid to create a better overall experience. Anyway, after completing Dark Souls and gaining greater confidence in both myself and, more importantly, in From Software, I then resolved to play future titles with as little external information as possible, and I did. This led me to missing a lot of content on my first playthroughs, including the entirety of Bloodborne's DLC and Cainhurst Castle, the Nameless King and Ancient Wyvern in Dark Souls 3, several endgame bosses in Sekiro, and Dark Lurker in Dark Souls 2. In fact, I've still never found Dark Lurker. Where is he lurking? Maybe I will never know. The point is, there is obviously a downside to playing these games blind, most clearly shown by how you can miss so much content. But I still believe this is the objectively best way to play these games, if you can. It results in you being so much more immersed and absorbed in these worlds. There's a much stronger sense of accomplishment from doing things on your own, and certain moments of discovery you get to make by yourself can be amazing. This is the best way to play, or at least that's what I thought before playing Elden Ring. My first trip through the Lands Between felt like a constant yo-yo between being underleveled and overleveled despite my best efforts to avoid this. This didn't ruin the experience, but it did harm it. I don't want to win fights solely because I'm overleveled, as that's boring, and I don't want to lose as a result of being underleveled, it's frustrating. I also don't want to obsessively try to manage my character's level to always ensure some correct amount of difficulty. Really, I just want to play the game and become immersed in its world, not fixate on micromanaging its balance issues. This has been caused by the open nature of the game's world, and many have praised this feature, but it clearly comes at a cost. Some have claimed higher level bosses are an effective way to communicate where to go, but in my experience, this wasn't true at all. From Software games are known for being challenging, and how can you accurately determine what level of challenge is intended and what isn't? Of course, if you go to Caelid right at the start of the game, enemies will be so high level that combined with the zone's oppressive appearance, it does effectively communicate that you shouldn't be here yet. But otherwise, things are rarely so clear. Also, running into a high-level boss and dying for a long time only to eventually give up and go somewhere else is, to me, a firmly negative experience, and returning when overleveled to crush them is even worse. The traditional Souls experience of coming across a challenging boss and then trying to learn from your mistakes to eventually overcome them seems far better. Still, Margit I didn't mind, the Falling Star Beast I minded a little, and the Godskin Apostle I minded rather a lot, but this wasn't the worst part. That came from times I found myself overleveled. As I said in the last section, Lindell is amazing, and it was my favourite part of the game, but I was still overleveled, and this meant that the climax to spending hours exploring its streets and working my way upwards towards the foot of the Erd Tree was 2 easy boss fights, both of which I killed on my first attempt. This was particularly disappointing in the case of Morgott, because this was clearly an important story moment, and I didn't achieve victory through anything resembling skill. I got hit over and over, and learnt to dodge nothing, and instead just used my now abundant healing to power on through to victory anyway. You only get to fight a boss for the first time once. Well, I guess that's not really true for most bosses in Elden Ring, as you fight each boss for the first time an average of 3.89 times, but in the story, you only get to fight a boss for the first time once. And it sucks to have that experience ruined for you just because you went to certain places in the wrong order. That said, there was still an upside to playing blind, and certain moments of discovery that came from exploring, particularly the world's underground sections, are up there with some of my favourites across all of From Software's games. So there are positives and negatives to playing blind. What's the big deal, you might say? Well, if this tale ended here, I wouldn't be writing all this. But that's not how this story ends, because I did not complete Elden Ring blind, because I wasn't able to. It was the 14th of June at 7:14 PM when I first met Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and it was the 14th of June at 9:31 PM when I first killed Malenia, Blade of Miquella, and it was at 9:32 PM that night that I realised something was wrong.
You will witness true horror. Now, rot. By the scarlet rot.
2 hours and 18 minutes is a long time. I'm not sure if any one boss across any of these games has ever taken me that long to defeat before. I think the final boss of Sekiro might be the only one to actually exceed this. Except 2 hours and 18 minutes wasn't how long it took me to defeat Malenia, Blade of Miquella. It was how long it took me to reach the second phase. For the first time. Before this, I assumed there was no second phase because this seemed rather hard enough. Finding out I was wrong was not a welcome revelation. It was 11:39 PM that night when I officially gave up and wrote into Google, Malenia Spinny Attack. So, 4 hours and 25 minutes. That was how long it took for Malenia, Blade of Miquella, to end my blind playthrough. I just couldn't work out how to deal with the big spinny attack. The only times I survived it were as a result of getting lucky and just scraping through with a sliver of health, and that didn't work in the second phase because of the added scarlet rot. So I cheated. I looked it up and read a wiki, and through this I learnt a method to deal with waterfowl darts. That is the name of the attack, by the way, the attack so many people, including me, struggled with. You block the first hit, dodge quickly into the second, and then do a delayed dodge backwards, or just walk back carefully to avoid the third. Most people don't use a shield for the first part, and instead either try to stay at range during the times they think this attack could happen, or just use a specific art of war called Bloodhound Step to dodge it. Using a shield is not ideal, as to block this successfully you still need to be some distance away when the attack triggers, and to have near full stamina for your block to not be broken. And outside of this single attack, a shield is completely useless, because Malenia heals when she hits you, even when you block, meaning you're sacrificing a lot of DPS just to block a single part of a single attack, and even that blocking is unreliable due to distance and stamina requirements. However, my playstyle involved staying close to enemies, so trying to stay at range for an attack that can't be predicted seemed impossible, and using Bloodhound Step is something I never could have discovered on my own, so I felt like it would be wrong to use it. Of course, I'm not sure if I ever could have worked out the block, fast dodge in, slow dodge back method on my own either. It is a very specific set of moves the game is forcing the player to perform, and I had already spent over 4 hours without developing the slightest idea of how to deal with this attack beyond frantic dodging while praying for good RNG. I would love to know how many hours this fight would have taken me if I hadn't looked this information up, because I assume it would be quite a large number. Still, I do know how long the fight took with this knowledge. My final try of the night ended at 1:42 AM, at which point I went to bed. At 11:14 the next morning I was back at it again, and it was 10:01 PM on June the 15th that Malenia, Blade of Miquella, tasted for the first time that which I had come to know so well. This means defeating this boss took me 26 hours and 47 minutes in real-world time, of which I believe about 12 to 14 hours were spent actively trying. I did take breaks for various reasons on the second day. The kill itself took just under 10 minutes, and it ended with me only just surviving. Now, there are many things I could say about this, but I will try to be as brief as possible while covering as many important points as I can fit in. So, overall, I found the experience to be not particularly enjoyable, although it wasn't terrible or anything. As the hours dragged on, I did often find myself reflecting on just how long the boss fight was taking and just what else I could have been doing with my time instead. I don't have much free time, so it did feel a little wasteful to spend so long on a single boss that soon just felt repetitive. You may wonder why I didn't just give up, or even use a more meta approach, but in my defense, I had no idea the fight would take this long. If I had known, maybe I wouldn't have bothered, or maybe I would have used a more meta build, but I didn't. Also, there were plenty of times I came relatively close, even after just a few hours of attempts, so in a way it made sense to keep trying. Lastly, there was probably a little bit of pride involved. The game had presented a challenge and I wanted to overcome it, and in previous From Software games, this feat had always been made very achievable if you just keep trying and try to learn from your mistakes. You may also wonder why I didn't experiment more, as maybe it was my build or playstyle holding me back. But I did experiment. I tried positioning close versus keeping at distance, being aggressive versus being more patient, using a one-hander with shield versus two-handing and trying to switch at the start of waterfowl, dodging specific attacks to the left versus dodging to the right, and all sorts of other little tweaks. I did my best to experiment and to learn, but in the end I found Malenia to be a rather poor teacher. And I did consider changing weapon, but I had no idea what other weapon might be better, and the more time I spent with my axe, the more I worried changing to anything else would force me to have to relearn all the timings and windows I had gotten used to. In many ways, being stuck on a boss fight is actually one of the least appealing times to go find a completely new weapon and playstyle. So, in the end, I stuck with my axe. It had worked on every other boss after all. That said, after spending more time with this game, I do think experimentation with different weapons is a good thing, both for increasing the player's strategic options and for providing more gameplay variety, making me think that Elden Ring should have been designed to try to encourage this. As it is, weapon upgrades require specific materials, and this often ends up limiting the player's ability to change weapon without downgrading in power, particularly for any weapons requiring normal smithing stones, which the game is incredibly stingy with compared to somber ones. So I think a much better system for Elden Ring would be to instead upgrade the blacksmith's tools with smithing and somber smithing stones so that the player can just swap weapons freely. Upgrading individual weapons is tradition in these games, but in such a big game with so many different weapons, this doesn't seem like the best fit anymore. On my second playthrough on a fresh character, I killed Malenia using the Bloodhound Step Ashes of War, alongside some claws I found in Stormvale Castle, which I thought might make me look cool. This second time was far easier, taking me just under 1 hour, and it did feel satisfying to get some revenge, even if using Bloodhound Step to deal with Waterfowl Dance does feel rather cheap in how drastically it lowers the difficulty. The main emotion I felt on killing Malenia the first time was confusion. Why did this take so long? How much of this is me and how much the boss? What were other people's experiences with this fight like? What was the intended experience From Software were trying to create? I also felt a little concerned over any remaining bosses because I wasn't sure if they were going to be even harder. Luckily, they were not even close. Still, I did indulge my curiosity by checking what other people's experiences were like. Mostly YouTubers and streamers, as that's what's easy to find. Watching other people defeat Melania was a little strange, and not just as a result of some of the more questionable things I saw.
Did I just beat Melania and show my dick on camera?
What I learned through this was that people do different things, but most people use the summon by way of the Spirit Ash Mimic tier, and even those who in theory had a similar no magic, no summon playstyle to me seemed to approach the fight very differently to what I did. I think this is best displayed by Asmongold, who killed the boss in what I consider to be a rather impressive 2 hours and 20 minutes. His playstyle involved two things, running away and using jumping power attacks, and this seemed to work well. Unlike me, he didn't try to dodge Melania's attacks outside of getting space to run away, and he didn't use a single non-jumping attack, he exclusively jump attacked from start to finish. It turns out jumping power attacks are very meta for strength builds, to the point where some players, like Asmongold, might use them exclusively for certain fights. These jumping attacks have several advantages. They provide fast gap closers, give you iframes on much of your hitbox, do high damage, do high amounts of stagger, and do considerable posture damage, which eventually grants you a stance break and critical hit. Jumping power attacks are strong, but I never knew that. Now, in Elden Ring's defense, there is one pop-up message during the tutorial which mentions jump attacks, alongside charged attacks as a means of stance breaking, so the game does tell you they exist. In my defense, you can't see posture damage, and to go alongside this brief pop-up, the game only provides a basic enemy who doesn't even react upon receiving a jumping attack, which doesn't do a very good job at communicating that this is an important or even useful part of your toolset. Keep in mind that jumping attacks have been a part of these games since Dark Souls 1, and they have never seemed very useful in the past. So I never thought to start using them now. This may be a good thing. Having another tool at your disposal that you can strategically employ when it fits a specific situation is a big positive, but I don't think I would enjoy playing through the entirety of Elden Ring doing nothing but jump attacks. To me, that would make the gameplay less varied and ruin some of the immersion, even if it is a more effective way to play. So maybe I was actually lucky that I didn't realise jump attacks are the meta for strength builds. Then again, I spent over 12 hours fighting Melania, so maybe not. There has been a lot of discussion about the difficulty of Elden Ring, and people seem to be broadly split into two groups. On the one side, you have people praising Elden Ring for the way it has increased accessibility and lowered the high difficulty From Software is usually known for. And on the other side, you have people criticising the difficulty for being harder than From Software's other titles and moving the experience towards being unfair or unfun. These two groups would seem to hold contradictory beliefs, as this game can't be both easier and harder, but the reason for this difference of opinion is simple. They are the result of different playstyles. Now, you might think there are hundreds of different playstyles in a game with as many options as this, but really, there's only two which matter. And it's not summoning and not summoning, nor is it magic and non-magic. The two playstyles are following the meta or not. And if you follow the meta, this is quite likely the easiest game of this type From Software have ever made. And if you don't, particularly if you go as far as to play the game blind, this is the hardest game they've made, by a landslide. Now, in terms of boss movesets, these games have become more challenging over time. Go and replay Dark Souls and you might be amazed at just how simple and easy many of these once infamous fights are by the standards set by later games. Enemies attack slowly and predictably, with clearly telegraphed attacks that provide obvious windows for the player to counterattack. But as these games have evolved, boss attacks have evolved with them to try to continually increase the difficulty in proportion to the player base's natural increase in skill. By Elden Ring, this has resulted in longer combos, shorter downtime between attacks, more variable attack speeds to make dodge timing more confusing, and more ranged, tracking and AoE attacks. Basically, dodging has become harder and harder, and knowing when to counterattack has been made less and less clear. This has had two major consequences. The first is that as the difficulty has risen higher and higher, it has started to reveal the cracks in From Software's core gameplay. In many ways, difficulty is a lot like pressure, in that you can only turn it up so high before its container bursts. For me, this was Malenia, and I could go into several specific grievances my time with this fight revealed, but to name just a few, when you stance break Malenia, there is a chance that input buffering, which is the way player inputs are queued, leads to you attacking her again straight away, which not only removes your chance to do a critical hit, but for some reason also causes Malenia to instantly use Waterfowl Dance, which you'll then be too close to avoid. She does this every single time you hit her when stance broken, and it killed me every single time. I'd estimate I died 10, maybe 20 times to this alone. Now, some people have been complaining about input buffering in these games since Dark Souls, on the basis that action games should be responsive, and I remember seeing these complaints and thinking that really this was no big deal, until I reached a difficult boss where input buffering repeatedly killed me. Another problem I had was the inconsistency of staggering Malenia, where sometimes an attack would stagger her, but sometimes the same attack wouldn't, and she would cancel straight into a now unavoidable attack. Someone actually made a YouTube video proving this, but the main point is that people need consistency to be able to learn, so a boss reacting randomly to being hit is a problem. A third problem is just Waterfowl Dance. No attack should require such a specific counter, and all this does is exclude many builds and playstyles while making the fight exceptionally difficult to work out without external help. Still, more generally speaking, I think the higher than the game can handle difficulty is why so many people have described Elden Ring's late game as unfair or unfun. It's in the late game that the difficulty really jumps up, and it's here that people start to question why they have to dodge so many times in a row just to get a single chance to counterattack, or why punish windows are so unclear now, or why the camera doesn't zoom out against larger enemies, or why certain attacks trigger quicker than the average human reaction time. When the difficulty rises high enough, the cracks start to show, and when the cracks get big enough, it risks bringing down the foundations these games are built on, such as the idea that they are hard but fair, or that if you keep trying you will improve, or that all weapons are designed to be viable. Still, this is just one of the consequences of turning up the difficulty. The other is that players respond by setting their own difficulty. This is what players are doing when they check a guide, or a wiki, or a beginner's tips videos, or they look up the strongest weapons or best builds, or ways to cheese bosses. This is what leads them down the path of the meta. The game effectively becomes too difficult for their standards, so they try to push the odds back in their favour using whatever help they can find. Now, to be fair, this is obviously something that happens regardless of difficulty, as there will always be some players who just want to make an experience as easy as they can, and also this applies to more than just Elden Ring. However, the problem is that Elden Ring increases the difficulty so much that players feel forced to try to find more meta approaches or rely on other external help, as this can feel like the only way to overcome the challenge. I think this is clearly shown by looking at how streamers defeat Malenia. On people's first attempts, there is a lot of variance between different builds and playstyles, but on their actual kills, almost everyone have resorted to one of a few different specific meta approaches. What counts as a meta approach differs between fights, but in this case I would say Mimic Tear, Moonveil Katana, Rivers of Blood, Bloodhound Step, and possibly excessive use of dual heavy weapon jump attacks. There are 309 weapons in this game, plus 91 different Ashes of War and 64 different Spirit Ashes. So the fact that every single person is using the same 2 or 3 weapons, the same 1 or 2 Ashes of War, and only 1 single Spirit Ash shows quite clearly just how dominant the meta is. There are 1.8 million different combinations these tools provide, so seeing only a handful getting used says something. Basically, if you turn the difficulty up high enough, this is how people respond. Hell, even community legend Let Me Solo Her is still using the single most meta weapon possible for this fight. Clearly, this is not a player who lacks skill, but for millennia, they still followed the meta. This higher difficulty has caused a fundamental change to these games. Dark Souls was about learning, persevering, and overcoming, and this was reflected in both its mechanics and story. The solution to problems in Dark Souls was to keep trying, don't give up, don't go hollow. And the game tried to encourage this through things like deliberately telegraphing enemy attacks so that players understand exactly what they did wrong when they die. In Elden Ring, however, the game seems to punish players for their persistence, and tries to obscure information that might help players learn, all while overly rewarding looking up external information. For example, exploring the game for yourself leads you to always being the wrong level and missing side quests. Balance is terrible, making certain weapons, ashes and builds far more effective than others, and making many playstyles feel invalid on later bosses. Boss attacks are designed to be challenging and visually flashy, with no care given to how well they communicate information to players. No effort has been made to communicate how new mechanics like stance breaking work, or to teach players their effectiveness. Compare this to Sekiro, which added symbols, a visible posture bar, and specific boss encounters, all to try to help players learn. Leveling up is more min-max focused than ever before thanks to nonsensical scaling, where things like Vigor might increase your health by only 16 at level 8, but at level 40 it increases it by a massive 48. This makes leveling only Vigor by far the best way to go early, and yet this is deliberately hidden through the information that's available in-game. The addition of Torrent and the open structure of the world makes it effortless to ride around and gather healing and weapon upgrades early if you've checked where they are, while players who travel to areas in the wrong order can find themselves at a significant disadvantage. The most difficult boss fights have been given specific counters that are hard to find organically, like Bloodhound Step for Malenia, the Claw that parries Malekith, the Invulnerability Flask for Mog, and the ability to permanently sleep the Godskin duo to make it a 1v1, and on it goes. You could say that these are different games, and that they don't need to be the same, but for some players, the process of struggling, learning, and overcoming is satisfying and meaningful in a way that simply looking up a guide online isn't. Now, I won't try to argue that there aren't people who enjoy looking things up and playing these games that way. For example, here is Noah Javey describing his experience of using a guide to defeat Malenia.
On my second try, on the hardest boss of the game and perhaps the Souls-like genre in general, I managed to use my toolset to completely min-max my Mimic Tear so that all of her formidable advantages melted to nothing. I was able to completely shut down and bypass just about every individual element of her difficulty. There are people who would tell you that there is no way that this is satisfying, that it is not a fair fight and therefore not a valid one. I disagree. I don't know if I have ever personally felt such absolute incandescent joy after a boss fight, not across any other From Software games where I fought in a way that was more obviously fair. In my desperate desire to win by any means necessary and avoid being stuck on the 120th hour of the game, I went so far past what was necessary that my Mimic Tear represented a more dangerous and unbalanced foe than Malenia herself. This, to me, is not a cheese. It is a triumph. Perhaps the greatest triumph of my entire experience with From Software games in general.
So clearly, some people get great enjoyment from metagaming, and I think that's fine. What I don't think is fine is creating a difficulty so high that players who don't want to play this way feel forced to, or creating a difficulty so high that players aren't able to learn through perseverance anymore, or creating a difficulty so high that the cracks in the gameplay systems are exposed. And at the very least, this is what Malenia and Waterfowl Dance do, and I think you can make an argument that there might be more offenders than this. Now, surely there must be a point where hard becomes too hard. And have we not crossed it? So, I ask, why does the game have to be quite so hard? Players with the highest skill that want the hardest challenges are basically just the inverse of people looking things up to make the game easier, in that they do specific challenges or speedruns to make the game harder. So having a very high base difficulty isn't really catering to them anyway. Meanwhile, players with the least interest in a challenging experience already look things up to make the game easier, so a game that's already easier surely wouldn't harm their experience. And lastly, players who want to do things themselves, play with their preferred weapons and builds, and learn through failure could then, once again, be included. And by the way, for all the different criticisms I have heard over the years of Souls games, Bloodborne, and Sekiro, one thing I haven't heard very often is people complaining these games are too easy. So maybe it's time From Software stopped trying to outdo themselves by continually one-upping the difficulty, or if they really do want to continue down this path, then at the very least they need to vastly improve the balance and address certain gameplay problems so that these games can actually cope with this ever greater pressure the difficulty puts on them. If they don't, the meta will only become more and more dominant as more and more players come to see this as the way these games are meant to be played, while those who ignore the meta get punished more and more heavily, and apparently even mocked. There are a lot of things you could make fun of Elon Musk for, but one thing you can't is his Elden Ring build not being meta enough. And yet, Elon Musk's only slightly unusual build led to 20 plus articles, multiple YouTube videos, and thousands upon thousands of tweets, all about how stupid he is for playing the game slightly off meta, how dumb this is, how this is apparently disgraceful and offensive even. But I guess this is just what inclusive and accessible difficulty looks like. Thank you, From Software, what a great improvement. Meta is the enemy of fun. It ruins immersion, diminishes accomplishment, leads to less experimentation, less individuality, less agency, worsens any existing balance problems, reduces the sense of a shared experience, leads to arguments about the correct way to play, and just shits all over what should be an incredible gaming experience. Some games are about min-maxing, but this is not one of them. Some games suffer little if you look things up, but this is not one of them. And some games are competitive multiplayer experiences where there will always be a focus on the meta as players need every advantage to compete. But this is not one of them. I have seen the meta destroy entire genres. I have seen it bring some of the greatest games of all time to their knees, and I just fucking hate the idea of From Software's future games becoming more and more meta-centric, although seems like I'm already too late. The very final thing I need to address here is the inevitable question that ends up being asked alongside all this, which is, why don't you just use Spirit Ashes? They make the game easier, after all, and you complain the game becomes too hard, yet this is what Spirit Ashes are for. The answer to this is that summoning changes the gameplay to the point where it becomes an entirely different experience, and just because someone is a fan of one type of experience doesn't mean they enjoy the other. In Elden Ring, summons are more impactful than ever before. To some people, using them makes the game more enjoyable, and to other people, it ruins the enjoyment, because these are different experiences that appeal to different players. Many of the things which drew people to these games in the first place and led people to praise their gameplay aren't present when summoning, like the feeling of a 1v1 duel, or learning a boss's moveset, or overcoming a challenge on your own. Some people say From Software clearly intended all players to use summons, otherwise they wouldn't have added them, but I feel it's worth pointing out that From Software have still not bothered to include boss AI for summons. By which I mean, bosses are not capable of detecting that multiple opponents exist, meaning they always ignore one person dependent on who was the last one to damage them, leading to very unrealistic and easily exploitable boss behaviour. From this, I think it's clear that the gameplay experience with summons wasn't seen as much of a priority, making it hard to believe that the developers did intend all players to have to use them. Also, the argument that they exist, therefore all players are meant to use them, doesn't hold up, as this could be applied to everything in-game. For example, just because lots of shields exist, doesn't mean that this is the developer's way of telling people all players should use shields. If something exists, it's proof the developers want it to be an option, not proof the developers want it to be a requirement. Likewise, I don't know how anyone could claim that Spirit Ashes are balanced. Mimic Tier can solo any boss in the game, and this is after being nerfed. With a meta build, all the player needs to do is summon them and then go AFK. This is quite obviously not balanced, and I also don't see how this can be the intended experience for everyone. Still, at the very least, I hope people can understand how some might not find this very enjoyable. And again, I'm not claiming that no one would enjoy this, I'm just saying that not everyone would. These games have always had summons, and most people have always chosen to play without them. Summoning has always made these games easier, so players have a large incentive to use them, and yet many people still didn't, because for them it led to a less enjoyable experience. You might try to tell yourself this isn't true, and that people avoid summoning because of gatekeepers and elitists, but if you really think that, I would like to ask you, what is it the gatekeepers and elitists do to stop people from summoning? Because when you play one of these games, no one knows if you use summons or not, and there are no negative consequences to using them. Nor are there special perks for avoiding summoning. You cannot upload your no summon playthrough to Tinder to help you find a maiden, nor can you add it to your CV to find a higher paying job. People were freely able to decide for themselves whether to use summons or not, and many people chose not to, because that's what they found more enjoyable. Still, even if once upon a time most people didn't use summons, this isn't true anymore. In Elden Ring, the majority of people do seem to use them, which has led to a bit of a role reversal where now some people have started attacking anyone who dares not to use them for being an elitist or an idiot. But they're not. They are just people who enjoy something different to you, that's all. And if you were someone who considered it wrong to shame people for using summons in the past, should you not also consider it wrong to shame people for not using them now? For many things I've mentioned here, a large part of the problem revolves around how poorly Elden Ring communicates things to the player. Unfortunately, however, this poor communication also harms another part of the game. The fallen leaves tell a story, but I'm not convinced it's a good one. I have completed Elden Ring 2 times. I have watched a reasonable amount of lore videos, and I have spent a considerable amount of time reflecting on the information presented within this game. One thing I haven't found yet is any reason the player is meant to care about all this. Now, From Software have become famous for their confusing narratives, but I would like to compare the different openings of these games. In Demon Souls, you find yourself stuck in the kingdom of Boletaria, where demons are consuming the souls of humans to turn them into monsters. Humanity is facing an existential threat, and you become another poor soul trying to fight this. In Dark Souls, the life-sustaining first flame is fading, and it's resulting in humans losing their sanity. Humanity is facing an existential threat, and you become another poor soul trying to fight this. In Bloodborne, you wake up to find yourself trapped in a nightmare where people, and worse, are hunting you in the streets. Your objective is to survive the nightmare, and to do this you undertake a journey that transforms you from hunted to hunter. In Sekiro, you take the role of Sekiro, who has dedicated his life to protecting a child named Kuro. Someone Sekiro has many reasons to care about, like out of a sense of honour, Kuro saving his life, and Kuro being an innocent. And so, Sekiro tries to fulfill his duty and protect him. In Elden Ring, you are a tarnished who wakes up in the lands between, and then sets out to kill every important person here to try to become the Elden Lord. But this is not your war. so why would I want to get involved in it? And this is not your land, so why would I want to rule it? I mean, it doesn't seem like a very nice place. Everyone just tries to kill each other. There is a religious aspect to these events where you were apparently once banished by the light of grace, and now it is welcoming you back and trying to guide you. And it is nice that the light of grace wants me back after banishing me, but why would I want it back? It banished me, and as far as I can tell, I don't owe it anything. In fact, I don't even know what it is. Maybe we are stuck in the lands between, but other people do seem to travel between here and other places, like the Badlands and the Land of Reeds, so wouldn't a more sensible motivation be to look for a way off this rather dangerous island? Instead, we just set off immediately to kill everyone. This isn't completely insane, because killing people does make you stronger, but it's still very psychopathic. Imagine if you woke up on a strange island one day, maybe your plane crashed, and you find this island has some problems. There's even a war going on. Would you then jump straight into action to kill everyone and try to become the new island ruler? Because I know I wouldn't, so why does my character? Every important NPC we end up killing has done nothing to us. Some of them don't seem very nice. For one of them, it seems to be a mercy kill, but most of the time we just travel around looking for people to kill and steal power from. Now, in fairness, they do attack us, but we're the one trespassing into their domain and killing all their men, so we're starting it. The only reason we eventually get for all this is to repair the Elden Ring, but why would we want to do this? I mean, maybe repairing the Elden Ring is a good thing, but maybe it's not, and no one explains to us why it would be. Not all rings are good, just ask Celebrimbor. Now, if it sounds like I'm pedantically picking at unimportant details, then you are at least wrong about the last part. Because pedantic I might be, but these are not unimportant details, they are at the centre of the game's story. From Software have always withheld information and obscured details, but they've never tried to withhold and obscure everything, and Elden Ring is so committed to making everything as vague and confusing as possible that in the process it completely abandons the aspects that made previous games' narratives work, like having a strong central theme, or using obvious and easy to understand imagery and symbolism, or giving the player motivation for their journey, or ensuring the vagueness fits realistically with the setting. For example, in Dark Souls, there is a clear theme of struggle and finding your own way forward in spite of this, as well as death and facing an inevitable end. The imagery and symbolism involve a dichotomy between light and dark, as well as the fading of a flame, and people going hollow, and all of these are easy to understand, even without playing the game, in a way that Elden Rings and Greater Wills are not. The setting is one where most humans have already went hollow, so very few people are even left to explain things to the player, and when you do find someone who knows more than you, they do explain exactly what you should do, how you should do it, and why this is so important. Frampt isn't necessarily telling you the truth, but that's because he has his own motivations and is giving the player this information to try to manipulate them. Elden Ring also has a character who knows a great deal of information that is trying to persuade the player to do their bidding, and this character even travels with you for most of the game. And yet, Melina never explains why you should help her, despite this being something that's obviously in her best interest. I mean, it's not surprising so few players choose one of Melina's endings, as she never bothers to give a single reason why you should. Clearly this is not out of a lack of commitment to her cause, as she is quite willing to burn herself alive, but I guess telling the player why they should seek the Elden Throne is just too far. I mean, self-immolation is one thing, but a conversation with someone? Yuck. Now, there is a lot of lore in Elden Ring, and I'm not trying to deny that it can be interesting in its own right. In fact, I don't think there has ever been so much lore in any of these games before, But at the same time, I also don't think there has ever been so little reason to care about it. For some people, discovering the lore and trying to piece it together is like a game in itself, and some content creators can produce incredible things out of this, but I still believe that the player's experience within the game itself is the most important part, and that the only reason so many people even looked deeper into the lore of past games was because they felt their actions within the game had meant something. As for the lore, I think some of it deserves credit for being creative and interesting, but it also seems like there is a huge amount of unoriginality. For example, the main revelation in Elden Ring is that the ruling organisation of this land, the Golden Order, has a dark secret, which is that it's being controlled by a secret power, the Greater Will. But this is pretty much the exact same as Demon Souls, and Dark Souls, and Bloodborne, and Sekiro. I don't think the corrupt church is a bad trope, but I do think it's an overused trope, particularly by From Software, who seem to operate as if it's a narrative requirement. However, this twist doesn't work quite so well when we see it in every single game. Likewise, we are once more in a dying world, where the history suggests repeating cycles, where there used to be an age of dragons before humans came along, where the current age is being prolonged, leading to stagnation, where death has again went wrong, leading to no one staying dead, and where there is manipulation of unknowable outer gods. Again, not necessarily bad ideas, but certainly not new ideas either. Still, now that we have breached the topic of lore, I think it's about time the entire Souls community faces up to a hard truth, which is that telling your story through item descriptions is not good storytelling. And if you disagree with me saying that, perhaps you might believe the man who wrote them all, Hidetaka Miyazaki, who said on a Japanese podcast after Dark Souls released that the text is so small that he can't write anything decent and that he kind of gave up with them, saying this wouldn't do for a big title or serious game, but that it was good enough for them. Also, the reason he decided to write them himself as opposed to hiring professional writers was because he was happy to sacrifice quality to allow the game to be developed quicker, and so that he could keep updating them as the game evolved during development. In the end, this turned out well. Maybe Miyazaki was a better writer than he gave himself credit for, and maybe having a single writer allowed for the end result to be more cohesive. Still, I also think this method worked because it just so happened to be a perfect fit for the game. One of the greatest strengths of Dark Souls' story was its minimalism, and putting important lore on item descriptions worked well to complement this precisely because many players wouldn't feel the need to read them all. So in Dark Souls, story never got in the way, and the game's atmosphere, emotion and themes were thus given greater emphasis, all while the lack of direct storytelling was, in a way, able to become a part of the story. Still, none of this means that telling your game's story through item descriptions is itself a good method. The act of reading item descriptions can often be boring, and the questions of who wrote these and how are we managing to read them are simply never addressed. Some games avoid this by creating in-universe books you can read, where their content reflects the knowledge and biases of the author to allow the developers to give players incomplete information in a realistic way. And this is honestly a similar, but superior method. Still, more importantly, just because Elden Ring tells its story through item descriptions does not mean its story is good. And just because this worked in the past is not proof it will always work in the future. If the only way to understand even basic parts of the story, like what are our characters' motivations, is to read every item description, then I think the story has failed somewhere. In Dark Souls, item descriptions worked as they fit with the rest of the game, while allowing those who wanted to dig deeper an opportunity to do so, but Dark Souls wasn't reliant on its item descriptions. Item descriptions didn't exist to create an interest in the story, they existed to reward your interest in the story. And the vagueness of these item descriptions worked well with the game's themes of needing to struggle and find meaning for yourself. A similar argument can be made for Bloodborne, in how a key theme of that game was this impossible search for knowledge in the face of unknowable horror that both the player and the world's other inhabitants experience. Basically,
grant us eyes, grant us eyes, plant eyes on our brains to cleanse our beastly idiocy.
So, in Dark Souls and Bloodborne, being confused about the story is a part of the story. Meanwhile, in Demon Souls and Sekiro, the storytelling is not this vague. In fact, it's not even close. Demon Souls and Sekiro don't spoon-feed the player all information, but they do feature moments of exposition, as well as certain characters speaking plainly to the player about important events and what they mean. So Dark Souls and Bloodborne are vague for a reason, and Demon Souls and Sekiro are not this vague, so why is Elden Ring? I think this is the most cryptic From Software have ever been, but I never found a reason to suggest why this is, and I don't think it works in the story's favour. It's okay to leave players confused, but that shouldn't be the only thing they're left feeling. Anyone can make something that's confusing. It's not a sign that something's deep. Being confusing is the easiest thing in the world. And speaking about confusing, it's time we return to both of the problems raised in the previous section to discuss the side quests. These games have never done much to help players find these unofficial side quests, but in previous games, players were at least likely to travel through these worlds in a predictable order, and so most players were able to find most NPCs and see many of their interactions. It has always been difficult to see everything. Secrets have always been allowed to be secret. But there were plenty of chain NPC interactions most players would see, such as finding Solaire in Lost Izalith, or seeing the confrontation between Pate and Crichton. Elden Ring has more of these side quests than ever before, and I explored the game thoroughly. In previous games, this would mean I was able to see much of this NPC content, but in Elden Ring, I saw almost none, because so many quest lines have such specific requirements, and rely on you going to different places at different times in a way that almost no one would do without following a quest guide. Some of these require you to backtrack to places you've already been, but there's no way to know you should do this, and you can't expect players to regularly backtrack to past locations just to check if an NPC has turned up. Other quests might involve the player being told to do something which they won't be able to do until many hours later, making it hard to remember the quest even exists. Others need you to exhaust all dialogue or reload areas to trigger an update. And then there's Blade, attacking you on sight unless you'd bought a specific gesture from a specific merchant who you probably won't find until later, which easily ends both his and Rani's quest before they even begin. If players missed some quests because some were complicated, that would be fine, but if players miss all quests because all are complicated, then it's not fine. Much of this is the result of the open world that prevents From Software from being able to accurately predict the player's path, but they should have been able to predict this problem and implement this content better. Mostly though, this just feels like another example of how these games have come to be designed more and more for players following a wiki or guide, rather than anyone playing the game naturally. After all, it doesn't matter how complicated a side quest is, if players have a guide to tell them what to do. And I assume that is what many players resort to. I mean, you only need to look at the game's achievement statistics to see that something isn't right here. The Age of Stars achievement that is linked to the game's secret ending, something which has so many different requirements that it feels almost impossible to achieve without a guide, has been achieved by more players than all 4 of the normal endings combined. This doesn't just tell us that the majority of players use the guide to achieve the secret ending, it tells us that the majority of players did this on their first playthrough, as that's the only way this achievement could be more common than the others. This is a strange revelation to me. It is understandable that players might want what they feel is the best ending, but I can't help but wonder that if you have to spoil the ending of the game in order to get it, is it still the best ending? Overall though, I think this is just the same thing that's happened with the difficulty, where if you make something too hard, players will just find a way to balance it themselves, even if doing so has some negative consequences on the story. I don't want to repeat points I made earlier, so I'd like to provide a counterexample instead, to try to illustrate my overarching point in a different way, while also talking about the one area where I think Elden Ring's story does shine, which is how its strong imagery can combine with the exploration in a way to capture the player's imagination, provoking players to think for themselves and experience a sense of awe and wonder at the sights they see and the places they travel to. This was perhaps the main inspiration for Miyazaki's original decision to be so vague in his storytelling, and this, at least, does still work in Elden Ring. So, my highlight of Elden Ring's story, and one of my favourite moments with this game, came at the end of a long stretch of exploration. It started with a map marker. Yes, Elden Ring does have map markers, sometimes. This one was added in a later patch to signpost a new entrance to the underground that's opened after defeating Radahn. The underground already feels like this entirely new world, hidden away beneath the main one, but when exploring this new area, I was lucky enough to spot a message and item that pointed me towards a hard-to-find hidden path, which brought me to another new area that you can jump down to, the Aqueduct. This is actually the only entrance to this zone, but I didn't know that, and jumping down onto this thin support beam made me feel like I was entering somewhere I wasn't meant to be. Like I was trespassing and going outside the intended game zone. At the end of this area, I found a coffin, which turned out to be a lift, that brought me to another new zone, Deep Root Depths. And then, after some more exploration, I reached the end of this zone. Now, I want you to try to imagine you're me. You entered a hidden underground zone, only to find an even more hidden zone, which took you to another hidden zone, and at this point, you have no idea where you are, or what you'll find, or how this place can be so big. You feel like you've stumbled into an entirely new part of this world that players were never meant to see, a place of mystery and secrets. And at the very end of this journey, you find this. A decaying swamp full of roots and flies with some unknown monstrosity at its centre. You notice a giant fishtail first, and then an oddly angled arm, and something else you can't quite see in the middle, which you eventually realise as you get closer, is a face. Misshapen, oddly angled, sunken and rotting, but a face nevertheless. I know where this is going, you think to yourself. Things like this exist in these games to come alive and attack you. This is a game about boss fights, after all. But that's not quite what happens. Instead, at the foot of this disgusting abomination is a woman you know.
Ah, there you are. I knew you would come.
Well, that makes one of us, because of all the things I expected to find here in the darkest depths of this world, Fia was not one of them. Fia is the deathbed companion mentioned in the game's opening, and I met her in the Round Table Hold, where she once asked to hold me. She said I felt very warm, and offered to hold me as often as I needed. By the way, she actually permanently decreases your max health by 5% when she does this. What the hell, Fia? I didn't realise I was sharing my vigour quite so literally. I could have done with those hit points against Malenia. Anyway, I didn't know this at the time, and I liked Fia. She seemed nice. And here she was, in this place of death and decay, perched beneath this hideous monster, where she asks you this.
What is it you intend? To deny us and our ways, like the dogmatic brutes of the Golden Order?
And I thought about this. All signs here point to this being bad. This is not a pleasant place. There is a constant sound of flies buzzing in your ears while you talk, and it feels like the game is trying to tell you not to side with this person. But what the fuck do I know about fear or the Golden Order or what's right and wrong in this land? How could I ever confidently deny her her ways? I don't know anything about them. Which meant there was only one option left.
You are an odd one. I am the guardian of those who live in death. They call me a foul and rotten witch. Yet you still wish to be held by me?
And so she held me and whispered secrets in my ears, and my God, did they feel secret. In this moment, I felt like I'd wandered out of the game's intended playable area into somewhere completely new, somewhere I was never meant to be, only to find a person I was never meant to find, who is now telling me secrets I was never meant to hear. In this moment, I felt like I was the only person in the world to have ever come here and knelt in this place of decay to listen to fear's whispers. And I hope that if you maybe don't play these games like me and don't want to, that you can at least understand how there is a magic to not knowing where you're going and what you'll find, and instead just embracing the imperfections of wandering this world on your own, uncovering the secrets you can find, grasping at the little you do understand, while letting your mind fill in the rest. I never did find the item Fia was looking for, and so I wasn't able to progress her questline further. But if I had found it, I would have given it to her. And if I did get a choice at the end of this game, I would have chosen Fia. Because fuck the lands between, I know nothing about this place, and fuck these people, they mean nothing to me. But a hug is something I can understand, and compared to everything else out there, a hug seems as good a reason as any to take the Elden Throne. And if anyone wants to call me a simp for this, then I will at least need to see some proof that you didn't pick Rani's ending, because I refuse to be talked down to by anyone that looked up all the endings and then just chose the one where they get to be Rani's maiden. Anyway, it is my sincere hope that I will come to regret this section of the video in the months and years to come. I hope that time will prove me wrong, that there is more to this story, and that the reason Elden Ring seems to have so little to say is because it is yet to reveal its full hand. That Elden Ring's narrative is perhaps not meant to be considered as a standalone tale, but as the introduction to a new, interesting world that will be built upon by future DLC and the inevitable sequel. I hope I am wrong. But as it stands, it seems like Elden Ring uses vagueness not to serve its story, but as a mask to hide behind, to obscure its other problems, and people just accept this because vagueness is what From Software fans are used to, so how could it be bad? Still, from where I'm standing, the Emperor doesn't appear to be wearing any clothes, and I think most people are just afraid to say so. And, to be honest, that sounds like a good segue for the conclusion, so let's bring this to an end. I think Elden Ring is a good game. I think From Software are the best developer in the industry right now. I don't begrudge Elden Ring its Metacritic score or sales, and frankly I think it deserves them just as much as most other things out there. I understand how so many people can enjoy their time with a game like this, and I still look forward to whatever games From Software will make in the future. But I cannot deny that the main emotion I walked away from this game with was disappointment. Disappointment that it's a good game which could have been so much more. Disappointment that the best developer in the industry had taken so few risks and forgotten so much of what once made their games special. Disappointment that the lessons From Software are likely to learn from this are the wrong ones. And disappointment that the experiences other people seem to have had are so vastly different to mine, making me feel like my playstyle is no longer valid, despite the fact it was that same playstyle that still led to many of the best memories I did have with this game. People worry about games going open world because it leads to them diluting their core appeal, and that seems to be what happened with Elden Ring. People praise Elden Ring for its more accessible difficulty, and yet its higher difficulty has excluded more playstyles than ever before. And people are unwilling to criticize Elden Ring's story due to how impenetrable it is and the assumption that it must be good because it's from Software, even if that isn't actually true. Still, none of these are what I find most disappointing. In this post-Elden Ring world, I can't help but think about the game which shot From Software into stardom. In a time where every game developer was trying to make their games more accessible and more broadly appealing while always holding the player's hand and explaining everything, Dark Souls stood alone as a complete rejection of this. It was a game about doing things for yourself, finding where to go, making sense of an unclear story, overcoming challenging bosses, and finding your own reason to keep going. That was what Dark Souls was about, and it incorporated this into its mechanics, its setting, and its narrative. And people loved it. For many, it was one of the best gaming experiences they ever had, and its success created the foundation that would one day make Elden Ring possible. And yet, here we are, 11 years later, and From Software and their fanbase have turned this game into the exact opposite. Elden Ring punishes players for trying to do things themselves, and now everyone just copies the same few meta builds while using a wiki to tell them how to do the side quests and to check which ending they want, and then hopping over to YouTube to get someone else to tell them what they're meant to think about the story. Dark Souls was a game about thinking for yourself and finding your own way, so I can't help but wonder, what the fuck happened? And what is Elden Ring about? Well, to me, the main theme of the story seems to be about questioning and overcoming authority to try to create a future of your own. After all, the Golden Order is based on lies. The Outer Gods are manipulating this world and its people. Your journey tasks you with defeating those with competing visions, and the final boss we slay is the embodiment of the greater will itself, which then allows us a chance to define our own future as Elden Lord. So, I do have to admit I find it ironic that in a game about escaping the influence of exterior powers and following your own path, that the way people actually play this game and what the developers seem to encourage is the exact opposite. A lot of people have said Elden Ring is like Dark Souls. It's not, but I wish it was. Thank you for watching my video.